So the huge miscalculation of the West is panic decision, confrontational policies, and then finding out afterwards that, oops, what we did was counterproductive and self-destructive. Well, it's a general problem with Western perceptions of conflict that you divide them into two parties, normally the good guys and the bad guys, and then you feel an urge to say, we stand with this or we don't like them, or you focus on a leader on the top, whether Slobodan Milosevic or Saddam Hussein or whatever it is. If truth is the first victim in a war, complexity is the second victim. It's hugely complex what goes on in, let's say, Ukraine-Russia-NATO relations involving probably 30 countries over 30 years. If you take the Palestine-Israel, if that's even the right way to pronounce it or to describe it, I would say it involves the whole region of the Middle East. It's Iran and Saudi Arabia and all that, and the relationships with Europe and United States. So the moment you boil it down to say, good guys, bad guys, we stand with one, you've lost it completely, because the moment you take a stand between parties, you cannot do anything constructive. And that's why it goes so madly wrong. We've now had, since the war in Ukraine started, this saying that this is a Russia-Ukraine thing and Russia has invaded an innocent country and all that. I mean, that has nothing to do with reality. Intellectually and academically, it's lousy. This is a much more complex thing, namely NATO's expansion, which all important leaders promised the last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, never to do. I repeat this because there's a lot of lies about it. It's well documented that Gorbachev was promised that if he got a united Germany in NATO, if he accepted that East Germany, at the time part of the Soviet influence sphere, into NATO, NATO would not expand. The formulation was 1 inch. Now that is what NATO countries and the Western world and the US does not want to talk about. And therefore they focus on, this is Russia, who out of the blue, unprovoked, invaded an innocent country. Now, what was happening then was a very quick support, basically, by everybody who believed in that narrative, to close off Russia and say everything is Russia's fault. We did nothing wrong. It was unprovoked. And so you had a black and white and very massive reaction in favor of Ukraine, although nobody seems to have known the complexities of Ukraine either. The ethnic cleansing, the destruction of the Russian language, the civil war which killed 16,000 people over 8 years after the US orchestrated coup d'etat in Kiev that installed the pro-Western government. So that was a much more simple thing in the minds of people because they were told that that narrative was so simple. Now, if you go to the Middle East, the difference is that that is a much older conflict. It's probably, I mean, it's in that sense one of the world's oldest conflicts, and that's why it's so difficult also to heal it, because those who live in this area have never known peace. Now, what is the difference here is that the Western world, and in particular the non-West or the rest, knows the Palestinian issue and the repression and the apartheid that the Palestinians have been objects and victims of for so long. So people are in solidarity with the Palestinians because of the overkill, the arrogance and the nuclearism of Israel. In both cases, the leaders of the Western world did the capital mistake, taking sides, saying everything is all to Russia and everything is good in Ukraine, which none of it is true, and pumping in weapons, using Ukraine to make Russia weaker. And we know why they want to make Russia weaker, because when Russia is weaker and gone, if they could do it as a threat, they can concentrate on China. So it's much more complex, but both cases they took the stand. I mean, Madame von der Leyen immediately said on October 8, Europe stands with Israel. She should never have said that. It means that she is a conflict illiterate person and a person who does not know anything about peacemaking. We keep on arming, and I don't know how many 100,000 people have already died in Ukraine because of these stupid policies. It's deeply immoral, and many of these leaders, government leaders, are war criminals, but they will never be convicted. Well, I think the great surprise for people in the West, particularly NATO and the European Union, was that they immediately, without thinking, without doing any analysis of the consequences, decided these barrage of sanctions against Russia. Now, Russia has not been suffering from these sanctions, but the West Europeans have been. And the US decided, and that's on public, both by Madam Nuland and President Biden, that we will destroy Nord Stream. Nord Stream is history's biggest destruction of infrastructure and has had huge consequences for the economy, the gas import in Europe, the cheap gas that cannot get in anymore. And that's why Seymour Hersh's analysis of Nord Stream is basically censored away in the Western world, because he's probably right. But they found out that, contrary to their expectations, the rest of the world, 85% of humanity, lives under governments which do not support that policy against Russia. Like China, trying to keep neutral, but others too, saying, well, it was wrong legally what Russia did, but Russia had a reason to do it. Russia had said that it would do it because it cannot have a NATO member that close to its border with long-range weapons, 2 minutes flight from Moscow. Now, the Americans or the French or the British would never have accepted anything like that if they had had their countries there, where Russia is today. So the huge miscalculation of the West is panic decision, confrontational policies, and then finding out afterwards that, oops, what we did was counterproductive and self-destructive. And that's why I don't think that anybody is basically listening anymore to the Western world when it comes to Israel. The world knows that this is an asymmetric conflict where the Palestinians are as people, innocent victims. I'm not talking about Hamas, but the people, the Palestinian people, have been innocent victims for decades. And it's time to do something serious about it. And I hope that there will be mediation by the UN and by countries outside the West. The West cannot be a mediator in a conflict in which it is so heavily involved itself. You cannot be a mediator and a participator in a conflict. Well, the long story short is that there's only one organization that can do that, main organization, that's the United Nations. But the long story short is that the Western world has done its utmost, in contrast to China, to undermine the United Nations and not follow the normative framework of the Charter. We know there's a lot of bureaucracy and inefficiency and privilege in the UN, but the Charter is humankind's most important single document. It's the only time where the world's governments have signed something that Gandhi could have written. And that was done because we don't want war evermore. Now, then people say, but the UN is not very efficient and they couldn't do this and they couldn't do that. That's the wrong way of thinking. The United Nations can never be better or stronger than its member states want to make it. That was uttered in 1948 by its first Secretary General, the Norwegian Trygve Lie. And it's still fundamentally the most important thing said about the UN. If we don't, as member states, support it with money, clear mandates, all the things it needs, our best people, civilian and military, the UN will be a pawn in the game. If we don't deliberately avoid to elect forceful, visionary secretaries general, and the last one was Kofi Annan, if we find it not important to accept something beyond our own nation states, we are doomed. And I'm glad to sit here in Shanghai and say China is always very strongly emphasizing the importance of the UN and its charter. Now, when it comes to the concrete thing in the Middle East, there's a huge mistake made in thinking that this is an Israeli-Palestinian thing and can be solved with that and a two-state solution. Everybody now is back to a two-state solution, which we heard about for more than 20 years. Now, I wonder whether we should not expand it to the Middle East as a whole region and say, how can we put together the Middle East in a way that everybody would benefit, that it would be a win-win for all Middle Eastern countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, what have you, all these also devastated countries, in which a Palestine and an Israel could find a way to live together with a Middle Eastern OSCE, if you will, Organization for Security and Cooperation in the Middle East, a kind of economic community. The more, and that's the philosophy you have in China with the Belt and Road Initiative, the more we tie countries to each other economically, the less likely they are to start killing each other. So this idea, focus on Israel and Palestine, and then either say let one swallow the other or make a two-state solution. I ask myself, you make two states next to each other with the hatred that has built over decades. How do we know that a two-state solution will not end very quickly in a war between those two countries? Now, if you make a kind of security and peace arrangement for the whole Middle East, and maybe tie it in with the European Union, if it could behave itself a little bit more intelligently, and the United Nations, a huge permanent presence of the United Nations, peacekeepers, negotiators, civil affairs, and civil police people. We need desperately UN missions, well-financed, clear mandates, best people. And if we give that to the UN can help the world solve its problem. But it cannot do that with 6% of the world's military expenditures. This world is totally crazy with its priorities, its imbalance between militarism, weapons, and almost no money for the United Nations. Don't ever complain about the United Nations, but look at what your own country does, economically, politically, in terms of legitimacy, to make the United Nations a strong organization. All the member states, there might be more degrees, different degrees, all the member states are still living in the outdated world of nation states. My government is the most important. I have national interest. No. Intelligent government leaders today know that they have global common interest, not national interest. We all have to give something of our own priorities before we can solve humanity's very important problems together. And there's no future if we cannot work together.